Last 24 hours, there's been a certain amount of information trickling through from the front lines in Ukraine. It's not a vast deluge of information, but it is enough to give us something of an overview of what is going on. Let's start, first of all, with what the Russians are saying. There's lots of comments today from various Russian sources, and I'm going to start with Avdeyevka, which, as I've said many times, is a Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, very much on the nationalist side of the Russian political spectrum, strongly supports the war. It has a somewhat tabloidy approach to its coverage of domestic Russian news. And I will say this, there have been instances when it's not been 100% reliable, to put it mildly. But generally, I find that it does give a fairly good idea of what's going on the battlefronts. And obviously, one has to allow for its biases. But anyway, this is what it said in its report yesterday. And just late yesterday, and just to remind again, Avdeyevka does appear to have access to a great deal of information about what's going on the battlefronts in Ukraine, presumably either reporters there or sources within the various Russian military units. So it reports the situation on the fronts as follows. In the Svatovo-Kremenaya area, it says that Russian forces, with the support of artillery, are advancing in the area of Nevsky and Makeyevka. Russian troops have also advanced in Sporny, and where the Ukrainians have been squeezed out of the gas distribution station. Sporny is a village, or rather a small settlement, more than a village, bigger than a village, in Lugansk region. It was under Russian control during the summer of last year. The Ukrainians appear to have regained control of it at some point in the autumn, and there's been heavy fighting there ever since. It's considered important because control of Sporny might, in theory, enable the Ukrainians to launch some kind of offensive further east in the direction of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Conversely, from a Russian point of view, control of Smorny would assist the Russians in pushing forward towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. It's part of that complex of small towns and settlements that take up Siversk, Liman, all of those sort of places. Anyway, Russians claim, as we can see, that they are on the advance in this area. And by the way, there's a large forested area in this part of the battlefronts, where there's apparently been very steady fighting within the forest. The Russians consistently failed to push Ukrainian troops out of forested areas which they controlled back in the summer. They seem to have significantly improved their ability to do so this year. I suspect because they have much more infantry available than they did last summer, when, of course, their forces were much smaller. It's one area where the huge call-up of reservists that took place in September has enabled the Russians to take the initiative. Anyway, that's what Avdeyevka tells us is happening in the northern part of the battlefronts. And it moves south to Bakhmut. And it says in the northern part of Bakhmut, of course, it calls Bakhmut Artyomovsk. It uses the Russian name for the town. Wagner forces are moving towards the Zabolnitsa district. The Posyelok district is now under Russian control. Wagner forces are squeezing the Ukrainians out of this territory. in the Vodor Canal region. Not sure where that is, but someplace within Bakhmut. That region has now also passed fully under Russian control, and fierce fighting is taking place in the Samolyot region. Now, Samolyot in Russian means a jet plane, and what I presume this is referring to is the area where there used to be a monument to a MiG-17 fighter jet. It was a place very much marking the entrance, the western entrance of Bakhmut, and Ukrainian soldiers who were sent to Bakhmut regularly had themselves photographed in front of this particular monument. Now, if that's correct, then this report puts the Russians well on the western outskirts of Bakhmut, because, as I said, this monument is definitely located in the western part of Bakhmut. Anyway, we'll see. There are other reports which we'll come to shortly about what's going on in Bakhmut, more detailed reports than this, but we'll come to those in time. And then it finishes. This is Redovka in the Avdeyevka sector. Russian troops have attacked the Keramika area, ceramic works perhaps, I'm not sure. Russian forces have also advanced in a place called Nevelskoye, and fierce fighting continues in the western part of Marinka. This has been a long-standing area of contention. Whilst I'm on this topic of Marinka, there's been a very interesting tweet from that somewhat mysterious commentator, Big Serge. I've received a private email which tells me that he is indeed an American, though an Orthodox Christian, and he's certainly somebody who speaks Russian. Anyway, Big Serge has been an interesting commentator about the war. He's provided photographs of Vuhledar, and these photographs show, or appear to show, the enormous impact of these precision-guided 500-kilogram glide bombs that the Russian Air Force is now launching against these apartment buildings, these high-rise apartment buildings in Vuhledar, which dominate the landscape and which up to now have made it very difficult for the Russians to approach Vuhledar. The Russians seem to be systematically destroying these high-rise buildings, using these glide bombs, and that perhaps will enable them eventually to break through the defences in Vuhledar. Many, many weeks ago now, an Indian correspondent wrote to me privately, pointing out the difference between artillery fire and bombs when it came to dealing with heavy fortified structures. He pointed out that an artillery shell contains a relatively small amount of explosive compared to a bomb. I've seen somewhere that it's about 30 kilos of explosive in a shell, as opposed to 500 kilos, well, maybe not quite that much, but say several hundred kilos of explosive in a 500 kilo bomb. And of course, a 1,500 kilo bomb would have an amount of explosive an order of magnitude greater. So you can do enormously more damage to structures, fortified structures, by bombing them than by shelling them. The reason the Russians have not been able to do that until recently is because of the presence of the Ukrainian air defense system. But as discussed in many programs, this has now become very severely degraded. And though the United States has been trying to beef it up with dispatches of Patriot anti-aircraft missiles and other systems, it's clearly no longer the force that it was earlier in the war, something which has allowed the Russian Air Force, to operate with far more freedom than it was able to do just a few weeks and months ago. So that was an interesting commentary from Big Serge and some rather interesting photographs showing the extent of the destruction of the apartment buildings by these enormous bombs. I would say, in case anybody is wondering, that I understand that Vugleda, some time ago, when it was essentially converted into a fortress, was apparently emptied of its inhabitants, and I understand that nobody any longer actually lives in these apartment buildings. I certainly hope that is the case. Anyway, that's Redovka's account. There has been another account of what's going on in the fighting, and this comes from another Russian site, one fiercely disapproved of by the US State Department, which is why, by the way, I've decided that I'm not going to name it. But anyway, it contrasts what it says are the excuses that the Ukrainians are coming up with, the bad weather, the lack of equipment, the excuses which supposedly are preventing Ukraine from launching in its offensive at the present time, with the active actions that the Russian military is taking. Now, as I said, this is, let me stress again, a website which the State Department disapproves of strongly. I believe it's, been subjected to some sort of penalties. I'm not going to name it for that reason, with apologies to its editors, by the way. I will say that my own experience of it is that it's pretty accurate, and like pretty much every other Russian channel I've ever used, even though it's supportive of the war, it is often extremely critical indeed of the Putin government and of the Russian military leadership, and does not hesitate to criticize and and sometimes in a withering way, things that the Russian government has done or said or failed to do over the course of this conflict. By the way, it was the first Russian site I saw which asserted that the Russian cruiser Moskva, which sank in the Black Sea back in the summer, it was the first site that I saw that actually endorsed the Ukrainian claim that the Moskva had been destroyed by a Ukrainian missile strike. Something, by the way, which to this day the Russians do not admit or confirm. But anyway, this is what this particular website, and as I said, I do apologize to the viewers, to the editors of this website. But anyway, this is what this website says the situation currently is on the battlefronts. It says that on the outskirts of Avdeyevka, Russian forces have slightly advanced near Vodyanoye. The Russians have launched offensive operations near the village of Bolshaya Novozyelka in the Vugleda area. They have taken control of two more Ukrainian strongholds near Avdeyevka, and fighting is also going on the outskirts of another settlement called Novo Kalinovo. And then it says, despite the bad weather, the soil in the forests of the northern Donbass front is not so muddy, and this has allowed the Ukrainian military to try to stage some counterattacks. I mentioned those in earlier programs, and it said that this site then goes on to say what other Russian officials have confirmed, that all of those counterattacks in this fiercely contested forest area, these Ukrainian counterattacks have all failed. And then the website turns to what's going on with the Wagner forces in Bakhmut. It says Wagner's fighters and Russian paratroopers continue to destroy the remnants of the Ukrainian grouping in Bakhmut without complaining about obstacles or bad weather. Fierce fighting continues in the town. Wagner forces are pushing through Ukrainian defences in the western part of the town. Footage has confirmed their control of the upper park and the Bakhmut 2 railway station. In the city centre, Wagner troops are moving towards high-rise buildings to the west of the station. I think this refers to by the way, to the big railway station, not the Bakhmut 2 railway station. But anyway, who's to say? Their advance is complicated by Ukrainian positions on higher ground, as well as by the fire of Ukrainian machine gunners and snipers who equip positions on the upper floors of multi-storey buildings. Well, I've discussed the advantages that gives the Ukrainians in the fighting in Vuhledar, and we have had instances recently of heavy bombing by the Russian Air Force of structures within Bakhmut as well, and it could be that it's these high-rise buildings that are being referred to. And then this piece, this site that goes on to say, in the southwest of Bakhmut, Wagner troop fighters are advancing along Grigory Skovoroda Street and Geologists Lane. In the north of the city, the fighting is going on down Krayanaya Street. And on the city outskirts, the battle for the main supply road, this is the road that passes through Khromovo, continues west of Khromovo. Wagner has not yet confirmed that it is in physical occupation of part of this road, but Ukrainian losses along it have certainly increased if they still risk to use the road at all. Well, we come to the question of this road and what's actually going on with it, I think, in a moment. And first of all, we now turn to what's going on in Bakhmut. We're going to specifically discuss Bakhmut now. And this comes now from Prigozhin. He's just issued a further commentary about what's going on in Bakhmut, and he says, our task is to grind down the Ukrainian army, not to leave the door open for a counteroffensive. We're having a lot of success with this. Those groups of Ukrainian troops who now reside in Bakhmut are being attacked by us and occupy an area of only 1 kilometer by 2 kilometers. I can say that our guys are doing a great job, but as for myself, there is room for improvement because it is necessary to fight harder so that not a single Ukrainian soldier is left. I wonder what exactly Prigozhin thinks that he should do beyond what he is already doing. As I said, he's not a commander. He's not himself even a fighter. He does provide us with a non-stop commentary of the fighting in Bakhmut. He makes all kinds of pungent and sometimes, I have to say, rather coarse statements about things that are going on in all kinds of places. I don't know what the troops of the Wagner organization make of all of that. But nonetheless, I don't want to dispute in any way that he does play an important role. I am sure that he is, in many respects, an inspiring leader. He's certainly there physically, continuously, with his men in Bakhmut. He's often seen there, wearing flak jackets and helmets and that sort of thing. And as I said, the fact that he's present, the fact that he's physically present, the fact that he speaks up for his men all the time, the fact that he lobbies for them with the Russian military and the Russian political leadership, the fact that he's able to enlist into Wagner the sons of top officials in the Kremlin, like Dmitry Peskov's son. All of that does show that he is doing an awful lot. Though, as I said, I do wonder what exactly he thinks he should be doing more of in this situation. But anyway, let's go back and consider what he says. He says that the total area of Bakhmut, now under Ukrainian control, is an area of 1 kilometer by 2 kilometers. And that, by the way, is roughly what I would guess it to be from the various maps I've seen, including, by the way, Ukrainian maps. The Ukrainians are clinging on now to only a very limited area of Bakhmut. They're still fighting. I don't know how many Ukrainian troops are still there. They're still clinging on to this small area of Bakhmut, but it is now very small. Most of the town now is under Russian control. Anyway, the Russian Defense Ministry has also been giving us updates of the fighting in Bakhmut, and this is now from Lieutenant General Igor Konashenkov, who is the spokesperson of the Russian Defense Ministry. He says that in the Donetsk direction, assault teams continue combat operations in the western district of the city of Artyomovsk, in other words, Bakhmut. Operational, tactical, and army aviation and artillery from the Southern Battle Group, jointly with airborne forces units, rendered support to the assault teams. Assault teams are a euphemism for the Wagner organization. I've discussed why the Russian law perhaps persuades the Russian military to use this euphemism, assault teams, instead of refer to the Wagner organization as such. But anyway, rendered support to the assault teams and thwarted the enemy's attempts to counterattack on the flanks. And Konashenko is then went on to say that Russian forces have also struck Ukrainian army reserves advancing towards Bakhmut over the past day, and in the area of the settlement of Bogdanovka. This is one of those villages to the northwest of Bakhmut, which is heavily contested. A strike was delivered against the enemy's reserves advancing towards the city of, well, I'm going to call it Bakhmut. He says Artyomovsk. Now, notice this interesting distinction in terms of types of aircraft that have been launching airstrikes, which Konashenkov is making in this statement. He says that operational, tactical, that's one group of aircraft, and army aviation aircraft have been rendering support to the assault teams. Now, I suspect that operational tactical refers to the big supersonic jets with the heavy bombs, the Sukhoi 30s, 34s, and 35s. And army aviation is helicopters and ground attack aircraft, specifically the Sukhoi 25s. So we see that Konashenkov is in effect telling us that both types of aircraft are operating in the Bakhmut area. And then we have also had another Russian commentator tell us about what's going on in Bakhmut. And this time it's none other than Denis Pushilin, who is, of course, the acting head of the government of the Donetsk People's Republic. Anyway, he says this. He says, active efforts are also underway to finally and definitively cut off the enemy's last supply route. The battles are raging in the area of the settlement of Khromovo. Despite unfavourable weather conditions and the fact that the basic road is under gunfire of control, gunfire control of the Russian forces, the enemy still has some pathways across fields. The goal is simple: to minimize and render impossible the enemy's movements. So this essentially confirms that the Russians have indeed cut the road through Khromovo, though they've done it to the west of Khromovo. But they're now trying to capture Khromovo itself, and notice that with the road through Khromovo cut to the west, the Ukrainian force defending Khromovo is also, one would assume, cut off from substantial resupply. The idea being to capture Khromovo and then push south, cutting off whatever remaining Ukrainian forces remain in Bakhmut from any prospect either of resupply or presumably retreat across those muddy roads and open fields, which is their only available point of entry and exit into Bakhmut. So that is what Pushilin is saying. So there we go. Now, not dramatic advances from in any terms, from any point of view, but an overall picture of steady Russian advances against what have historically been well defended and well fortified Ukrainian positions. And as I've discussed previously, as many people have confirmed, the only person who on the Russian side who seems skeptical about it is Prigozhin, but even Zelensky has confirmed it. If Bakhmut falls, then it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to hold on to Siversk further north. Avdeyevka further south will probably also become very vulnerable. The Russians will be able to take Chasov Yar, which Ukrainian soldiers have confirmed is extremely difficult to defend. It doesn't have high-rise buildings. It's a small, straggly village. Konstantinovka would probably be captured as well. And at that point, the Russians would be up against the last important defense line in Donbass, between themselves and the Dnieper River, which is the defense line that runs through the two towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Of course, there's also lots going on further south in the Marinka, Vugleda, Pakrovsk area. But again, if Avdeyevka is captured, and if Marinka is captured and Vugleda are captured, which is where the Russians are making a big effort to break Ukrainian resistance, then again, of course, southern Donbass falls under Russian control as well, a fact which, were it to happen before the Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye begins, would very severely complicate Ukrainian operations. Now, before I finish on the topic of the Wagner organization, I would say that there's been a report which I've seen. I think I saw it on Boris Rozhin's blog, which says that for the first time, Wagner fighters are going to participate in some form in the victory parades in Moscow on the 9th of May, which would be, I think, the first formal, official recognition of the Wagner Group that the Russian authorities have made up to this point. So we see that Wagner's activities in Bakhmut and, let's say it straightforwardly, Prigozhin's outspoken comments have obtained for this organization a degree of recognition that it has not been accorded up to now from the Russian authorities and perhaps even the wider Russian public. So that's where we are. That's what the Russians are telling us. What are the Ukrainians telling us? Well, they're telling us an awful lot less, I have to say. But there's been a number of things, and they're not particularly positive on the part of Ukraine about the situation on the battlefronts. Of course, in all of these places that we're talking about, in Bakhmut, in Avdeyevka, and wherever, the Ukrainians claim that they're holding on successfully against the Russian advances. But if you actually undertake granular study of these battles, if you look at the maps, it's clear that, in fact, despite these Ukrainian claims, the Russians are indeed advancing. But what the Ukrainians are telling us are other things. They're telling us, for example, there was a senior Ukrainian military official told us that the Russians have been engaging in very, very heavy bombing of Ukrainian positions in northern Ukraine. Now, this isn't exactly specific about where that is, but it's clear that this bombing is an ongoing operation, and it appears to be, from what I can gather, taking place in the Sumy-Chernigov region, which is the scene of much military activity in the fighting in February, March last year. The Russians briefly occupied Sumy and encircled Chernigov, and they very quickly pulled out of Sumy in their helter-skelter advance on Kiev in February 2022. But as I recall, by the end of March, they appeared to have tightened their control of the areas around Chernigov. But then, of course, following the seeming diplomatic breakthrough in Istanbul on the 29th of March, a breakthrough which, of course, was subsequently thwarted, the Russians pulled back from all of these places, and the Ukrainians were able to regain possession of them. Of course, the Ukrainians and the Western powers say that Russian positions had become untenable and that they were driven out from these places. And I think there's a certain amount of truth to that too, by the way. They're nothing like as much as Ukrainian and Western commentators like to claim. It's a topic that I might come back to another day. But anyway, there was a lot of fighting in this area, but there haven't been any Russian troops, ground troops, in this area for a very long time. So what is all this bombing about? And it's been going on for a while, for several weeks now. And, well, it's difficult to know for certain. Now, this Ukrainian official said that there's 17,000 Russian troops across the border from these places. As I said, I presume he means Sumy and Chernigov. He's put, by the way, the number of Russian troops in Belarus at just 2,800, which would appear to preclude any possibility of a Russian offensive towards Kiev from Belarus. And clearly that is not for the moment part of any Russian plan. But it's conceivable, given that apparently Ukraine's northern border is now very lightly defended, as Ukraine concentrates its forces in the east and the southeast of the country. It's conceivable that all of this bombing is targeting Ukrainian defense works, fortified positions built up by Ukraine along the border over the summer and autumn in preparation for some kind of renewed Russian attack in northern Ukraine. Who's to say? It's possible. There is another there is another report, or we should say there were a certain number of reports. They were very unofficial. And these reports were about, when unpacked carefully, these raids that take place across the Dnieper River in southern Kherson region, in the area close to where the Dnieper reaches the sea, and opposite Kherson city, which is of course on the west bank of the Dnieper, and from which the Russians pulled out back in the autumn. Now, cross-border raids go on all the time in this area. I covered a short time ago, in one of my recent videos, a piece in the British magazine The Spectator, which was based on an interview with a British mercenary who's fighting, or volunteer if you prefer, who's fighting with the Ukrainian forces in this part of the battlefronts. He was talking about how the Ukrainians try every so often to occupy particular islands in the Dnieper, and what invariably happens is that whenever they do occupy an island, they almost immediately attract the attention of Russian drones, and they're then fired upon by Russian artillery. And he gave a rather harrowing account, actually, of how these Ukrainian troops then try to hide in whatever buildings or structures or houses they can find in these islands, but the shelling often will destroy the houses around them, and more often than not, in fact invariably from what I could see, after establishing a brief presence in these islands, they have to pull back to their own territory on the west bank of the Dnieper. And this has been going on now for weeks, ever since the Russians pulled back from Kherson. And by the way, it also happens in the other direction. The Russians also from time to time launch raids on particular islands. There's very few firefights. This particular British volunteer, so that the only time he'd ever been close to the Russians, the only Russian soldiers, the only indicator of that was some rustling that he heard in the undergrowth. He has never actually seen a Russian. All that he ever encounters is Russian artillery, and he described it as its effect in pretty devastating terms. But the Russians do launch from time to time their own reconnaissance groups onto these islands, and about 2 weeks ago they also in effect confirmed that they occasionally launch raids across the Dnieper itself onto the west bank. There was even a story, which I give no credence to, that the men of one particular Russian reconnaissance group operating west of the Dnieper in Ukrainian-controlled Kherson region managed to capture a Leopard 2 tank and disappeared it inside a bog. As I said, I don't believe that story. But anyway, it's clear that the Russians from time to time launch reconnaissance groups across the Dnieper onto the west bank, and it's also something I've been aware of for some time, that the Ukrainians occasionally launch their own reconnaissance groups. They sent them east onto the east bank, the Russian-controlled east bank of the Dnieper as well. And for a short time, again, Ukrainian troops will occupy an isolated house or structure that they find. This is very much on the Dnieper estuary. The Russians then learn about them, the drones find out about them, the Russian artillery opens fire, and these small units scatter and dart back across the Dnieper back to the west bank again. And this has been going on, as I said, for weeks now. What the purpose of all of this activity is exactly, I am not really sure. It seems very costly, possibly for both sides, but especially the Ukrainians, given that it's the Russians who have, the preponderance of weight of artillery here. But anyway, it's been underway for a while. I haven't featured or talked about it because this sort of thing goes on all the time in war. I don't really see that it's particularly important. Anyway, perhaps because things haven't been going too well for Ukraine on the battlefronts recently, a number of Ukrainian bloggers and channels and such things suddenly began to talk up these stories, claim that the Ukrainians have established some kind of foothold on the east bank of the Dnieper. And this particularly referred to an area called the Dacha area, which apparently is swampy ground, and in other words, very much part of the Dnieper estuary. There are a few, as I said, structures there, but apparently it's rather isolated. And it's, again, as I said, a little bit like those islands. It's not a significant area in any way. And the Ukrainian presence there is always very sporadic and short-lived. Anyway, these stories were then picked up by the Institute for the Study of War in the United States, in Washington. They talked up all of this, and spoke about how they geolocated some Ukrainian troops on the east bank of the Dnieper, this particular area, and this was supposed to confirm that the Ukrainians now had a foothold east of the Dnieper. And then this has been picked up also by the Guardian newspaper in Britain, which has been running with this story incredibly for 3 days. This, despite the fact that Ukrainian officials themselves seem to be denying this story. They seem to be saying that there is no Ukrainian permanent presence, no Ukrainian bridgehead east of the Dnieper. And Boris Rogin, amongst others, other Russian commentators, has been saying the same thing. And he's reproduced a commentary from a Russian military correspondent, Roman Saponkov, and who has essentially confirmed what I've been saying. He says that groups of, this is from Saponkov, groups of Ukrainian troops do sometimes cross the Dnieper, but they're immediately covered by Russian artillery fire and never stay there on a permanent basis. And he says this is information this is Saponkov saying this is information that's been provided to him by people he knows and trusts. And he says that it's problematic to catch boats, to catch boats with artillery, especially at night, I'm guessing, if they're talking about small boats. And so Saponkov says that he considers this issue with the islands and the landing on the left bank closed. And I have to say, I agree with this. It seems to me this is a really rather desperate story, actually. I think people perhaps are reading a lot more into this than they should. As I said, I've known about these minor raids going backwards and forwards for some time. I don't attribute any significance to them. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts, as far as I can see today. Now, it's been a very interesting cluster of articles in the US media, all of which are telling us the same thing. And I'm not, for that reason, going to read through these various articles because, to a great extent, they duplicate each other. But we've had articles in Politico, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. And the basic weight of these articles is as follows: that there will be a Ukrainian offensive, probably sometime in mid-May or perhaps a bit later. The New York Times tells us that 12 brigades will participate, and the New York Times tells us that these brigades each brigade numbers around 4,000 men in total, which would constitute a total force of around 48,000 men, which is more than the 30,000 that Big Serge was talking about a short time ago, but less than the 60,000 that others have said, and the 200 or 300,000 that Prigozhin has at times implied. So 48,000 is a substantial force, but hardly an overwhelming one, also one feels. And all three of these articles tell us essentially the same thing, that though the Ukrainians themselves continue to insist that this is going to be an effective knockout blow, people in the United States, the US military, the intelligence community have their very, very strong doubts. They don't expect this offensive to achieve anything of any great significance. It might recover some territory, but it is unlikely to do so. And all three of these articles are also telling us what was already said in that article by Foreign Policy some time ago, especially the New York Times article, that this offensive depends a great deal on whether Ukraine is able to achieve tactical surprise in the part of the battlefronts that it attacks, and the implication is that the Russians have to be panicked in order for this offensive to achieve any significant success at all. And I have to say that assuming that the Russians can be panicked is an extremely dangerous strategy. Now, the article in Politico went on to say that there are the concerns about the possible failure of this offensive, and Politico actually used the word failure for the first time in connection with it. The possible failure of this offensive is causing concerns within the Biden administration about the possible political damage to the administration itself. And the Politico article goes on to say that the administration is now caught in a crossfire of potential attack from two sides. On the one hand, there are the realists and the people who think that it's never been the US business to involve itself so deeply in this particular war. If the offensive fails and it becomes clear that Ukraine is losing, then these people will say that the Biden administration led the United States up a path towards a further debacle, and that this is a huge investment in prestige and resources and material and in money to no useful purpose. The other side, the hardliners, and the article quotes people like Kurt Volker, who was at one time, as I remember, participating in the negotiations to make the Minsk agreement effective. Putting a person like that in charge of something like that is to guarantee the failure of the Minsk agreement, but never mind. Anyway, Kurt Volker and people like him, Ben Hodges, and all of those. By contrast, if the offensive fails, will say that this is for the opposite reason, that the administration didn't go in deeply enough. They didn't give Ukraine enough. They didn't give Ukraine ATACMS missiles, F-16 fighters, every conceivable weapon system that Ukraine should be getting. And one Ukrainian official that I was talking about yesterday, Ambassador Melnik, he said that the West needed to put aside any idea of red lines. It needed to devote 1% of its GDP. This is the collective West, both the US and the EU, 1% of their GDP to providing military aid to Ukraine, which is an astronomical amount of money, if you think about it. For a country like Ukraine, Ukraine would be receiving more military aid if that were ever to happen, much more military aid than the total size of Ukraine's GDP. In fact, I mean, it's a ludicrous idea. But anyway, let's put all that aside. Melnik said that the United States and the West needed to forget all about red lines. Ukraine should be given whatever weapon system it demanded, in whatever number it wants. An argument which, if followed through to its logical point, would mean that if Ukraine demanded nuclear weapons, the Western powers should give Ukraine nuclear weapons. An absurd idea. But anyway, you have people on the other side, as I said, the hardliners in Washington, in Europe, who in effect are going along with that. If the offensive fails, they will turn on the administration and they will say that it didn't do enough. And so you can already start to see the nervousness, the concern about what is going to happen. On the one hand, Ukraine really has no option but to conduct this offensive. And we're seeing more and more Ukrainians coming up with concerns about this. The Ukrainian general that I was speaking about, who the other day was talking about Ukraine being exhausted, its army being exhausted, Ukraine never having enough weapons to defeat Russia. Apparently his name was also Melnik, General Melnik. Apparently he has no connection to Ambassador Melnik. He's now somewhat backtracked on some of those comments. But when you actually read what he says in this backtrack, it largely confirms his original points. Ukraine just doesn't have the men or the machines or the ammunition, first and foremost, to achieve the kind of knockout blow, the kind of victory that it would need to achieve if it was to end the war from a perspective, with some prospect of victory or success. And the Politico article is saying that in order to try to avoid this problem of Ukraine insisting on maximalist, unachievable objectives, which will mean that a failure in this offensive to gain much territory would be construed as a defeat, that the United States is trying to persuade Ukraine to water down, to moderate its expectations of what this offensive can achieve. Well, there we are. I mean, that's a cascade of articles now, as I said, appearing in the American media, the US media, which perhaps illustrate how comprehensively the situation has changed since the summer and late autumn and autumn of last year, late summer and autumn of that year. I remember at that time when Ukraine launched its offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region, there was high optimism, or at least there appeared to be high optimism in the West about the successful prospect of these offensives. I never remember at that time reading articles like this. We can see the difference that the Russian mobilization in September, the appointment of General Surovikin as theatre commander, the cranking up of Russian defense industry, the armaments industries, and the restocking of weapons, the depletion of the West's own arsenals of weapons, the inability to provide Ukraine with the necessary numbers of shells, we can see the change that this is now causing in the mood. Whereas there was some confidence in the summer and autumn of last year that Ukraine's offensives would succeed, that confidence this time has essentially drained away. And I noticed that Admiral Kirby, the Pentagon spokesman, is now once again talking up the possibility, or risk if you prefer, that we're going to also see a Russian offensive very soon. Which, by the way, if the Ukrainian offensive fails, especially if it is comprehensively defeated and repelled, I would have thought is a real possibility. Now, there is some interesting information on the military technical side of things. Now, there's a report today which I cannot confirm and which again needs to be taken with some care, but there is a report that over the last few weeks the Russians have deployed to the battlefronts their absolute most advanced, most sophisticated tank, the T-14 Armata. And this is coming from Russian sources, and supposedly the T-14, as I will call it, the Armata if you prefer, is not being used in actual tank-to-tank combat. It's being used as a kind of long-range artillery. Perhaps the operators who are operating this tank are being trained to understand how it works and are being tested out on the battlefronts, and the tank is being tested out on the battlefronts in that kind of way. Now, I don't know how many of these tanks the Russian military has. The last time I saw a number, which was about 2 years ago, the Russian army at that time had placed an order for something like, if my memory serves me rightly, around 100 of these tanks as a sort of test batch. And it could be that this is the number of tanks that is being deployed on the battlefronts, or something on that sort of order of magnitude. Now, that may not sound like a lot, and it's certainly a lot less than the thousands of other tanks that the Russians have on the battlefronts. They probably have hundreds of T-90Ms, for example, which is also a very advanced Russian tank indeed, even if not quite as advanced and as sophisticated as the Armata. But bear in mind, as of now, there's only 60 Western tanks, Leopard 2s and Challenger 2s, on the Ukrainian front lines, on the Ukrainian side. That number will increase to perhaps 100 in total. So it could be that we're going to have more Armata tanks facing Ukraine than Ukraine has Western tanks facing Russia. And of course, some of these Western tanks, the Leopard 2, the Challenger 2, even the Abrams tank that Ukraine is going to eventually receive, these are much older, less sophisticated tanks than the Armata or indeed the T-90M. Now, I want to say again, I'm not making comparisons, tank versus tank. I'm not able to do that. It may be, for example, I know some people think so, that the Armata tank is a lemon, that it's overcomplicated and over-sophisticated and it won't perform well on the battlefronts. Who's to say? But I come back to this point that if we're talking about modernity, sheer modernity and sophistication, the Russians arguably have more modern and more sophisticated tanks even than the tanks, the Western tanks, with which Ukraine is now being supplied. The T-90Ms and certainly the Armatas are more modern and more sophisticated than any of the Western tanks that Ukraine will receive, has received, or will receive at any point this year. The second thing is to say is that all of these articles that I was speaking about acknowledge that it is going to be impossible for the West to sustain Ukraine's weapons needs beyond this offensive at anything like this level that we have seen up to now. And specifically, from 2024, the West's ability to continue to supply Ukraine with weapons systems on anything like the kind of scale we've seen in the past is going to basically run out. Brian Beletic has talked about this brilliantly, so has Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vashinin. I'm not going to add to what they say. Its problem is not a lack of money, it is a lack of industrial capacity and a lack of arsenals, of stockpiles getting depleted, and there is simply no way around this problem. And to illustrate this, we now have an interesting article in the Financial Times about the situation with those 1 million shells that the EU was supposed to supply to Ukraine. And what we learn is that it simply isn't going to happen. There just aren't enough. There's no agreement in the West about supplying shells in anything like the number of quantities, the quantities that would be needed. And we read, for example, that a landmark pledge by the EU to pool cash for joint production of ammunition was supposed to help Ukraine fight a war. Instead, EU member state diplomats are the ones in conflict, and there's a huge row now underway about whether these shells are to be sourced in Europe, these 1 million shells Ukraine was promised are to be sourced in Europe, or whether the Europeans should go on a buying spree, trying to buy shells in South Korea or wherever. And one way or the other, the 1 million shells Ukraine was promised. And by the way, I hadn't appreciated that the agreement to buy 1 million shells, which the EU announced, was the same agreement as the agreement to supply Ukraine with 1 million shells. The EU does this repeatedly. I got the impression initially that these were two different programs, but they've turned out to be one and the same. Anyway, the point is that this program has collapsed, and we have the Financial Times saying the outcome is that as Ukrainians continue to die with inadequate supplies of ammunition, EU diplomats are spending hours arguing over what European means, and of course all the blame inevitably is being put on France, which supposedly is insisting that all the shells must be sourced in Europe. I'm going to say again, the idea that there are vast stockpiles of available shells, especially 155 millimeter shells, that the EU can somehow source, lying idle around the world for the EU to simply step in and buy and then ship to Ukraine, I think that is unrealistic. And I think that probably was the original idea, but I suspect that it's turned out to be the fundamental problem. It just isn't the case that third countries outside NATO, countries like India, Brazil, the Arab states, wherever, are prepared to part, South Korea, are prepared to part with hundreds of thousands of shells, of these shells, in order for the Europeans and the Americans to achieve their political objectives in Ukraine. So that project has failed, and I suspect it's one of the fundamental reasons why there is now all this pessimism about the prospect of the coming Ukrainian offensive. So that's one thing. There is another thing also in the Financial Times, and it is about this latest plan to impose a total embargo on exports of goods to Russia. And what we now learn is that this idea has also collapsed. This is again, the Financial Times tells us this. The G7 embargo idea has met with very strong resistance from other EU countries. They're not prepared to endorse what was originally an American idea at the G7 summit. And this is what the Financial Times says. The EU and Japan have pushed back against a US proposal for G7 countries to ban all exports to Russia as part of negotiations ahead of a summit of the world's most advanced economies. The proposal was made by the US, according to two officials. It comes amid rising frustration in Washington with the existing system riddled with loopholes that allow Russia to continue to import Western technology. In other words, the sanctions have failed. People in the United States are getting frustrated. People like Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken are becoming frustrated. They came up with this blockade idea. The EU and Japan have made it clear that they're not happy. And we go on to read in the Financial Times, representatives from Japan and EU countries suggested in a preparatory meeting last week that such a move would not be feasible. From our perspective, it is simply not doable, said one official. And the article that goes on to say the disagreement over the measure underscores the lack of additional options available to G7 leaders as they seek to increase the economic punishment of Vladimir Putin's regime after 14 months of war, following a number of sanctions measures that were designed to cut off vast swathes of Russia's economy from Western imports of technology, machinery, and finance. And the article then goes on to say that the EU has agreed on 10 packages of sanctions against Russia, but only after weeks of wrangling between member states. Some of them have secured carve-outs and exemptions for their industries by threatening to veto the restrictions. Replacing that regime with a full export ban plus exemptions would risk reopening those debates and the potential weakening of existing measures. So, the sanctions have failed. The embargo idea is undoable. It's not feasible. It did seem to me like a fantastic idea. I would not be surprised, even despite all of this, even despite reading in the Financial Times that EU and Japanese officials say that this is unworkable, that the US will pile on the pressure to the point that something like this is actually put in place, but it won't succeed. It won't achieve its objective. None of the sanctions packages have achieved that objective up to now. This one won't. Either it will simply create even more problems within the global trading system, which is already overburdened by too many sanctions to function smoothly, a fact which is partly responsible for the inflation problems which we're seeing around the world. But nonetheless, it's not impossible that something like this, crazy and foolish though it is, might eventually be put in place. There's a famous comment attributed, wrongly by the way, to Albert Einstein, which says that, one definition of madness is doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. When it comes to sanctions, that's where the West has found itself. Sanctions against Russia. They thought back in February last year, with the shock and awe sanctions, that they were going to cause the Russian economy to crater. In fact, the statistics now point to a significant surge in growth on the part of the Russian economy this year. But not refusing to accept that the sanctions have failed, even though they have done, the West, or at least the hardliners in the West, demand more and more and more of them. Even though it's clear that those sanctions are now causing more problems for the Western economies than they are causing the Russian. As I said, a definition of madness, which might validly apply in this case, but so much of Western policy, not just over the Ukrainian issue, but over so many other things, the emerging conflict in China being perhaps the most glaring, has become irrational, that perhaps madness with respect to sanctions should not surprise us too much. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, buy yourself the magic mugs, the hats, the hoodies, the t-shirts, the sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.